Silence. That's what the pilot remembered most. Not the roar of engines or the rush of wind through the bombardier's bay, but the silence that followed the flash. From 30,000 feet above Hiroshima, Colonel Tibbets watched as a pillar of fire erupted from the earth, climbing faster than anything natural, faster than anything human hands had ever made. The mushroom cloud bloomed against the morning sky, white and purple and gold, a monument of physics made visible. The shockwave rolled outward in concentric rings, flattening everything it touched, a perfect circle of annihilation, expanding at the speed of sound. In that moment, watching the cloud rise higher and higher, piercing the stratosphere itself, Tibbets understood something that would take the rest of the world days to comprehend. This was not a bomb. This was something else entirely. 90 feet beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, in a reinforced concrete bunker designed to survive direct hits from conventional explosives, a group of officers gathered around a single sheet of paper. The message had been decoded minutes earlier, transmitted from what remained of the communications network in western Honshu. The words made no sense. They read the message again and again. Entire city destroyed by single bomb. Nature of weapon unknown. Casualty estimates impossible. Hiroshima has ceased to exist. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, placed the paper on the table with hands that did not shake, but moved with unnatural slowness, as if the air itself had grown heavier. Around him, the other members of the Supreme War Council stood in silence. Admiral Soemo Toyoda, General Korichika Anami, Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki, men who had spent their entire lives studying war, who had commanded armies and fleets, who had planned operations across oceans and continents. They stared at the message, and in that underground room, isolated from the summer heat and the sounds of Tokyo above, they encountered something that all their years of training had not prepared them for. On August 6, 1945, the Japanese High Command discovered a weapon that shattered 2,000 years of military thinking. War had changed, forever, and they were the first to truly understand what that meant. To understand the magnitude of this discovery, you must first understand the world that existed before it. The war Japan had been fighting for nearly 4 years was built on principles that would have been recognizable to generals from any century. Territory, supply lines, industrial capacity, troop strength, morale. These were the variables that determined victory. The Japanese Imperial Army and Navy had constructed their entire strategic framework on these fundamentals. When Admiral Yamamoto planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, he calculated carrier positions, aircraft ranges, fuel consumption, the probability of achieving surprise. When General Homa invaded the Philippines, he considered troop ratios, supply routes, defensive positions, the resilience of his soldiers versus the resilience of the enemy. The Japanese High Command believed with absolute conviction that American industrial superiority could be offset by Japanese fighting spirit. This was not propaganda, this was doctrine. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, was embedded in every strategic calculation. They had watched their soldiers fight to the last man on islands across the Pacific. They had seen kamikaze pilots transform aircraft into weapons of pure will. They believed, truly believed, that the spiritual strength of the Japanese people represented a strategic asset that could be quantified, deployed, leveraged against American steel and oil. Their planning documents reflected this worldview. The defense of the home islands, Operation Ketsugo, was predicated on making an American invasion so costly in blood that Washington would negotiate rather than continue. They calculated acceptable casualty ratios. They positioned millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of aircraft, suicide boats, mines, fortifications. They believed they understood the mathematics of attrition. If they could kill enough Americans, destroy enough ships, down enough planes, the United States would stop. This was warfare as they understood it. This was warfare as humanity had always understood it. The morning of August 6th began like any other morning of the war. Air raid sirens had sounded over Hiroshima at 7:45 when reconnaissance aircraft passed overhead, but the all-clear followed quickly. By 8 o'clock, the city had returned to its routine.
Workers headed to factories. Officials prepared for their morning briefings. Children played in the streets, enjoying the final weeks of summer vacation. The sky was cloudless, perfect blue, the kind of day that felt too beautiful for war. At 8:14, radar operators detected 3 aircraft approaching from the east. 3. Not the hundreds that had incinerated Tokyo in March, not even a dozen. 3 B-29s flying at extreme altitude, possibly on a reconnaissance mission. No alert was sounded. In the war rooms of Tokyo, if anyone noticed the report at all, they would have dismissed it as insignificant. 3 aircraft could not threaten a city. This was known. This was understood. This was wrong. At 8:15 and 17 seconds, the world broke. The flash came first. Witnesses who survived, who had been shielded by buildings or looking away at the precise instant of detonation, all described the same thing. Light. Not bright light, but light beyond brightness. Light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Light that burned through closed eyelids. Light that left shadows of human beings permanently etched onto walls and pavement. The temperature at the hypocenter reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel vaporized, stone melted, human bodies ceased to exist, converted to carbon and ash in a fraction of a second. Then came the heat wave. Miles from the explosion, people's exposed skin simply ignited. Clothing burst into flame. Wood, paper, fabric, anything combustible began to burn simultaneously across an area of nearly 5 square miles. The thermal pulse lasted only 2 seconds, but in those 2 seconds it created a firestorm that would consume what the initial blast had not destroyed. The shockwave followed. At ground zero, the overpressure exceeded 500 pounds per square inch. Buildings did not collapse. They disintegrated. Reinforced concrete structures, designed to withstand earthquakes, shattered into fragments. The blast wave moved outward at 700 miles per hour, faster than the speed of sound, so the destruction arrived before the sound of the explosion itself. People and vehicles and trees were picked up and hurled through the air like leaves in a hurricane. For miles in every direction, windows exploded inward, sending glass shards through bodies like shrapnel. And then came the silence. Survivors would speak of this silence, the eerie, absolute quiet that followed the roar, the silence of a city that had simply stopped. No traffic, no voices, no machinery. Just the crackle of flames and the sound of things falling, settling into new configurations of ruin. From the Enola Gay, the crew watched in something approaching awe and horror. The co-pilot Robert Lewis wrote in his log, "My God, what have we done?" The mushroom cloud continued to rise, climbing to 40,000 feet, then 50,000, a pillar of destruction that could be seen from 150 miles away. It was beautiful and terrible, a physical manifestation of forces that human beings had only theorized about until this moment.
In Tokyo, the first reports came in fragments. Radio silence from Hiroshima. That alone was unusual. The city had functioning communications equipment, redundant systems, trained operators. Then came the reports from surrounding areas. Reconnaissance pilots radioing that they could see smoke from 50 miles away. Railway workers reporting that all lines to Hiroshima had gone dead. And finally, the message that would reach the war room beneath the Imperial Palace. The officers reading that message had spent their entire careers interpreting intelligence reports. They knew how to assess battlefield damage. They understood the difference between exaggeration and accuracy, between panic and observation. But this message contained details that made no sense within their framework of understanding. A single bomb, one bomb, that had destroyed an entire city. Not damaged, not heavily bombed, destroyed. General Umezu ordered immediate confirmation. He needed to know what kind of attack this had been. How many aircraft? How many bombs? What type of weapon? The conventional calculus suggested that destroying a city required hundreds of bombers, dropping thousands of incendiaries over hours. Tokyo had burned for 2 days after the March firebombing raid. Over 300 B-29s had participated in that attack.
The Americans had dropped more than 1,500 tons of bombs, and Hiroshima was gone after a visit from 3 aircraft. The second wave of reports arrived throughout the afternoon. These were more detailed, compiled from eyewitness accounts from survivors who had been at the periphery of the blast. A flash brighter than the sun, a mushroom-shaped cloud reaching into the stratosphere, a single bomb parachuted from the aircraft that had detonated in mid-air. Buildings destroyed at distances where conventional explosives would barely break windows. Burn victims who had been miles from the explosion. And radiation, though they did not yet have a word for what they were seeing. People who seemed uninjured, dying hours later. Blood pouring from their mouths and noses. A sickness without precedent. In the war room, the maps and charts and operational plans that covered the walls suddenly felt like relics from another age. General Anami, the war minister, read through the reports in silence. Admiral Toyota requested data on American bombing patterns, looking for an explanation that fit within known parameters. There was none. Prime Minister Suzuki, the oldest man in the room at 77, had served in the military since the age of 16. He had fought in the Russo-Japanese War. He had seen the evolution of warfare from cavalry charges to aircraft carriers. He understood innovation, but this was not innovation. This was transformation. Lieutenant Colonel Saburo Hayashi from the Army Intelligence Division presented his preliminary analysis. Based on the physical effects, based on the eyewitness descriptions of light and heat, based on the unprecedented scale of destruction from a single weapon, there was only one possible explanation. The Americans had successfully weaponized atomic fission. Japan's own physicists had theorized such a weapon. A team led by Yoshio Nishina had been working on nuclear research since 1940, but they had concluded, correctly, that building an atomic bomb would require resources far beyond Japan's capacity. The industrial infrastructure alone would be staggering. The enrichment of uranium, the precision manufacturing, the theoretical work, the testing. They had calculated that such a project would require years and resources that Japan simply did not have while fighting a total war. What they had failed to calculate was that America did have those resources. In the mountains of Tennessee and Washington state, the United States had built entire secret cities. Oak Ridge employed 75,000 workers. Hanford employed 50,000. Los Alamos, the research facility where the bomb had been designed, was a hidden metropolis of scientists and engineers working around the clock on a single project. Japan's nuclear program consisted of a few hundred researchers working in scattered laboratories with limited funding and even more limited materials. The United States had mobilized an entire segment of its economy to build a weapon that many scientists believed might not even be possible. And now that weapon existed, and Japan had just experienced what it could do. In that underground room, the generals began to comprehend the implications layer by layer, like archaeologists uncovering artifacts from a civilization they did not recognize. The first implication was tactical. The number of aircraft no longer mattered. Air superiority, in the conventional sense, was irrelevant. A single plane, flying at high altitude, could destroy a city. Japan's entire air defense network, what remained of it, was designed to combat formations of bombers. Radar operators looked for large groups. Fighter pilots scrambled to intercept squadrons. Anti-aircraft batteries calculated firing solutions based on multiple targets. But if one plane could obliterate Hiroshima, then air defense became meaningless. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, Japan's remaining cities were now targets that could be destroyed individually, methodically, with clinical precision. The second implication was strategic. Supply lines did not matter. The Americans did not need to establish forward bases, stockpile conventional bombs, coordinate massive raids. They did not need to risk hundreds of aircraft and thousands of airmen. They could destroy Japan's capacity to make war without ever losing a plane in combat. The entire defensive strategy for the home islands, the plan to make invasions so costly that America would negotiate, was predicated on the assumption that the Americans would have to land troops, fight block by block, lose soldiers in numbers that would shock the American public. But why would they invade? Why would they sacrifice a single soldier when they could simply erase cities from the sky? The third implication was existential. Fighting spirit meant nothing. Yamato Damashi, the concept that had sustained Japan's war effort, the belief that will could overcome material disadvantage, was rendered obsolete by physics. There was no courage that could withstand atomic fire, no training that could protect against thermal radiation, no morale that could survive the instant vaporization of everything within a mile of ground zero. The kamikaze pilots, the soldiers who had fought to the last man on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the citizens prepared to resist invasion with bamboo spears, all of them were suddenly irrelevant. The Americans had discovered a form of warfare that bypassed human courage entirely. General Anami, who had argued most forcefully for continued resistance, who had believed that Japan could inflict unacceptable casualties on an invasion force, sat in silence. Admiral Toyota, who had planned to use the remaining ships of the Imperial Navy in a final suicidal attack against the American fleet, stared at the map of Japan as if seeing it for the first time. Prime Minister Suzuki, who had survived an assassination attempt just months earlier by officers who believed he was too willing to consider surrender, now faced a reality where surrender was not a choice, but an inevitability.
The intelligence reports continued throughout the evening. Colonel Makoto Sato from the Army Ministry presented a comparison of scientific resources. The United States had mobilized approximately 130,000 scientists, engineers, and technicians for its nuclear program. Japan had fewer than 6,000 researchers in total across all scientific disciplines. The United States had spent $2 billion on the Manhattan Project, more than Japan's entire military budget for 1944. The Americans had built industrial facilities that consumed more electricity than entire regions of Japan. They had access to uranium from the Belgian Congo, to graphite, to heavy water, to computational resources that Japan could not even imagine. This was the discovery. Not that nuclear weapons existed. Japanese scientists understood the theory. Nishina's team had calculated the critical mass of uranium-235. They knew it was possible. The discovery was that America had done it, that they had built the weapon, tested it, deployed it, and were willing to use it. The discovery was that the gap between Japanese and American capability was not just wide, but unbridgeable. The discovery was that Japan was fighting a war against an enemy that had transcended the rules of warfare itself. In the days before Hiroshima, Japanese military doctrine had been built on centuries of tradition and decades of modern war. The generals in that room had studied Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. They understood combined arms operations, logistics, the importance of interior lines and exterior positions. They had learned these lessons in wars against China and Russia. They had refined these skills in battles across the Pacific. They were, by any conventional measure, master strategists. And in a single day, all of that knowledge became obsolete. The doctrine of defense in depth, the concept that an attacker must be worn down through successive defensive lines, became meaningless when a single weapon could obliterate the defenders regardless of their positions. The principle of concentration of force, gathering troops and equipment at decisive points, became suicidal when concentration meant presenting a single target for atomic annihilation. The concept of strategic bombing, which required months of raids to destroy industrial capacity, was replaced by the possibility of destroying entire cities in seconds. Every calculation that had sustained their planning was wrong. The assessment that America would tire of casualties, the belief that Japan's mountainous terrain favored defense, the hope that Soviet neutrality might be converted to Soviet mediation. All of it rested on the assumption that this was a conventional war,
a war where both sides operated under the same physical constraints. But Hiroshima proved that assumption false. This was no longer a war between two nations with different levels of industrial capacity. This was a war between one nation that had nuclear weapons and one nation that did not. The generals in that underground room understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the world at that moment, what this meant for the future. They were not scientists. They did not fully grasp the physics of uranium enrichment or the mechanics of implosion triggers. But they understood war. They understood power. They understood that humanity had discovered a form of violence so extreme that it changed the fundamental nature of conflict. And they understood that Japan was on the receiving end of this discovery. Fear, when it came, was not sudden. It crept into the room like cold air seeping through cracks. If America had one atomic bomb, they must assume America had more, perhaps many more. How many cities could survive? Tokyo? Osaka? Kyoto? The Emperor's Palace itself? The Americans had already demonstrated their willingness to use this weapon. They had not warned, they had not demanded surrender first. They had simply destroyed Hiroshima to demonstrate that they could. What would they destroy next? The psychological impact was profound. Conventional bombing, no matter how destructive, could be psychologically managed. Casualties could be counted, damage could be assessed and repaired. The survivors could rebuild, restore, continue fighting. But there were no survivors at the center of Hiroshima. There was no rebuilding vaporized steel and melted stone. There was no continuing when your city had been converted to ash in a flash of light. The atomic bomb did not just kill people and destroy buildings. It erased. It annihilated. It removed cities from existence as if they had never been. In the silence of that war room, each man confronted his own calculations. How many more bombs did America have? Would they use them on military targets or continue targeting cities? Was there any action Japan could take to prevent the next attack? The answers were grim. They had no idea how many bombs existed. They could not know which city would be next. They had no defense, no counterweapon, no strategy that could protect the population. For the first time in the war, the Japanese High Command faced a situation where their choices did not matter. America could destroy Japan, city by city, without risk, without invasion, without negotiation. General Anami, who had been the strongest voice for continued resistance, spoke quietly. If America could do this, if they could destroy cities at will, then fighting to the last man would not prevent defeat. It would only mean dying while Japan burned. Admiral Toyota, whose navy had once dominated the Pacific, acknowledged that sea power meant nothing against a weapon that could be delivered by air. Prime Minister Suzuki, who had hoped to use the Soviet Union as an intermediary for negotiated peace, understood that there would be no negotiation. America did not need to negotiate. They had already won. The question was no longer whether Japan could win the war. The question was whether Japan would survive it. Throughout the night, more reports arrived. Casualty estimates from Hiroshima began to crystallize. 70,000 dead immediately, perhaps 70,000 more injured, many of whom would die in the coming days and weeks from burns, radiation sickness, and the collapse of the medical infrastructure. One bomb, 140,000 casualties. The firebombing of Tokyo in March had killed approximately 100,000 people. That attack had required 300 bombers and over 1 million pounds of incendiary bombs. Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb that weighed less than 10,000 pounds. The generals calculated, if America had 10 atomic bombs, they could destroy Japan's 10 largest cities. If they had 20 bombs, they could eliminate every major population center. If they had 100 bombs, Japan would cease to exist as a functioning nation. And there was no way to know. The United States had kept the Manhattan Project completely secret. If they could do that, they could have dozens of bombs, hundreds. The Japanese High Command had to assume the worst-case scenario. They had to assume that America possessed the capability to annihilate Japan entirely.
On August 9th, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. The message was clear. Hiroshima had not been a singular achievement. It had not been America's only bomb, used in desperation. It was repeatable. It was a weapons system, not a demonstration. The generals in Tokyo understood that August 9th was not the end. It was a preview of what would continue unless Japan surrendered. Emperor Hirohito, who had remained largely silent during the war's strategic debates, spoke at the Imperial Conference on August 10th. His words were recorded and later broadcast to the Japanese people. He spoke of the new and most cruel bomb, of the continuing destruction that would befall Japan if the war continued. He did not speak of defeat or dishonor. He spoke of survival, the preservation of the Japanese people and the nation itself. The decision to surrender came not from military defeat in the conventional sense. Japan still had millions of soldiers under arms. The home islands had not been invaded. The government still functioned. But the atomic bomb had made all of that irrelevant. The war could not be won. More importantly, the war could not be survived if it continued. The generals who had spent years planning for decisive battles and last stands had discovered that decisiveness no longer mattered when the enemy possessed weapons that could simply erase the battlefield. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. For most Japanese citizens, this was the first time they had heard his voice. He spoke in formal court language that many listeners could barely understand, but the meaning was clear. The war was over. Japan had not been defeated by superior strategy or overwhelming force in the traditional sense. Japan had been defeated by a discovery that changed what war meant. In the years that followed, as historians and strategists analyzed the war's end, many focused on the atomic bombs themselves, the physics, the engineering, the moral implications of using such weapons. But perhaps the most profound moment occurred not when the bombs fell, but when the Japanese high command first understood what they were facing. In that underground room beneath the imperial palace, on the evening of August 6th, a group of generals discovered that the world had changed. They discovered that human beings had created a power that made conventional military thinking obsolete. They discovered that war, which had evolved over millennia from clubs to catapults to cannons to bombers, had reached a threshold where further evolution might mean extinction. This was not a discovery made by scientists in laboratories or politicians in meetings. It was a discovery made by soldiers reading reports of their own city transformed to ash. It was visceral, immediate, and terrifying. These men had devoted their lives to understanding war. They had studied its history, its tactics, its strategies. They believed they knew what war could and could not do. And in a single day, they learned that everything they knew was wrong. The atomic bomb did not just end World War II. It ended an entire era of human conflict. Before Hiroshima, nations went to war believing they could control the outcome, manage the destruction, achieve objectives through superior planning and execution. After Hiroshima, war between nuclear powers became unthinkable not because of ethics or morality, but because of mathematics. The mathematics of megaton yields and thermal radiation and fallout patterns. The mathematics that said any war between nuclear nations would end not with one side winning, but with both sides ceasing to exist. The Japanese generals in that underground room were the first to truly comprehend this. They were the first to understand that nuclear weapons represented not just a more powerful bomb, but a fundamental change in the nature of organized violence. They were the first to realize that humanity had created a technology that transcended the human ability to control its consequences. And they were the first to face the question that would haunt every subsequent generation. What do you do when you have created a power that can destroy everything, including yourself? In the ruins of Hiroshima, the old world ended. Buildings that had stood for decades, centuries in some cases, were reduced to rubble and shadow. But the physical destruction, as horrible as it was only the visible manifestation of something deeper. An entire framework for understanding conflict, for thinking about power and violence and the relationship between nations, had been incinerated along with the city. In the silence of Tokyo's war room, 90 feet underground, insulated from the sounds of the city above, the new world began. Not with celebration or triumph, but with the slow, terrible comprehension that humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The generals who gathered there, who had spent their lives studying war, discovered that afternoon something more important than any tactical innovation or strategic doctrine. They discovered that war itself had changed, that the rules that had governed human conflicts since the beginning of civilization no longer applied, that a single weapon could do what entire armies could not. In other words, they discovered what the atomic age meant, not through abstract theory or scientific papers, but through direct experience, through reports of a city gone, through calculations that showed no defense was possible, through the realization that courage and skill and even numbers meant nothing against physics unleashed. That discovery, made in silence and fear and growing understanding, was perhaps the most important moment in the modern history of warfare. Because in that moment, in that room, humanity first understood that it had created something capable of ending everything. And that understanding, born in the quiet terror of men reading reports they could barely believe, would shape every strategic decision made by every nuclear power for the next 8 decades and beyond. The mushroom cloud over Hiroshima rose into the stratosphere and then dissipated. But the knowledge it represented, the terrible clarity it forced upon those who witnessed its meaning, has never faded. It remains a permanent fixture of human consciousness, a reminder that some discoveries cannot be unmade, some knowledge cannot be forgotten, and some thresholds once crossed redefine everything that comes after. On August 6, 1945, in the burning ruins of one city and the underground silence of another, the modern world was born. And those who discovered it first understood, perhaps better than anyone since, exactly what that birth meant for the future of humanity.